The moon's surface was already burning when my shell broke through the clouds. I had not even finished my entry sequence, and already the sensors screamed with heat signatures, explosions, and the frantic chatter of two armies tearing each other apart. My orders were simple: observe, record, do not interfere. I had expected to arrive early, to watch a battle unfold from its calm beginning. Instead, I dropped straight into chaos, and my first thought was that I had made some terrible mistake with the coordinates. I had not. This was exactly where the Concorde had sent me. My name, if you can call it that, is a designation, Vel 9. I am an observer, a low-ranking analyst from the Threnac Concorde, a union of species that has mapped and measured nearly every corner of this galaxy. We do not fight wars ourselves. We watch them. We record them. We file reports on them, and then we decide, from a very safe distance, whether the species involved deserve our attention or our contempt. Humans had, until 3 days ago, deserved neither. They were new, barely out of their own solar system. A young, loud, disorganized species that other governments considered more of a curiosity than a threat. When the Dravith Coalition decided to seize a human mining colony on this moon, my superiors treated the resulting battle as a formality, a training exercise for junior analysts like me. I was told to expect a short skirmish, minimal casualties, and a quick human surrender. I was told I would be home within a lunar cycle. I remember feeling insulted by the assignment. Observing humans felt like being asked to catalog insects. Now hovering my cloaked shell 300 meters above the surface, watching the sky fill with fire, I understood that someone in my chain of command had been catastrophically wrong. Below me, the Dravith Coalition's landing force was pouring out of their transport ships in perfect formation, exactly as their doctrine demanded. Rows of soldiers marching in disciplined lines, shields raised, weapons synchronized. It was beautiful, in the way that a machine is beautiful. Cold, precise, unstoppable, on paper. The humans were not in formation at all. They were scattered across ridgelines and inside half-built structures, using the terrain in ways that made no sense to me at first. My tactical models, built from centuries of Concorde military doctrine, could not explain why a defending force would abandon a defensible perimeter to take up such broken, uneven positions. It looked like poor planning. It looked like panic. It was neither. The moment the Dravith line came within range, the human positions opened fire from 6 different angles at once, and the neat formation I had been watching simply stopped existing. I adjusted my sensors, certain I was misreading the data. Coalition soldiers were falling in numbers that did not match any model I had ever studied. The humans were not shooting where the enemy was standing. They were shooting where the enemy was about to run, cutting off retreat paths before the retreat had even begun. I began recording immediately, my systems trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A woman's voice cut through the comm frequencies I was monitoring, low and steady, giving directions to what sounded like a dozen different positions at once. I later learned her name was Grace Milton, a field commander barely out of her 20s, coordinating a defense that should have required someone 3 times her age and a decade of formal training. She did not sound afraid. She did not sound excited either. She sounded like someone reading a grocery list, calm and exact, while explosions rocked the ground beneath her. Left flank, hold your line. Ben, you're drifting again. Pull back to the ridge. A young man's voice answered, breathless, but somehow amused. Copy that. Just wanted them to think we were spread thin. They already think that. Now make them regret it. I paused my recording analysis, running the exchange twice to be certain I understood it correctly. There was no fear in either voice. There was no formal command structure being enforced through threat of punishment, which is how discipline works in every military doctrine I had studied. There was something else instead, something that resembled trust. The Dravith commander, a seasoned officer named Threx Calor whose service record I had reviewed before this mission, ordered a second wave forward, certain that the first wave's losses were simply bad luck. I understood his logic. Numbers alone favored the coalition overwhelmingly. Even significant losses should not have mattered against a force this size. But the humans adapted faster than any species I had studied. Within minutes, they had shifted their formation entirely, falling back from an exposed position on the eastern ridge and drawing the second wave of coalition soldiers directly into a corridor between two collapsed structures. I did not understand the purpose of this movement until the corridor detonated, taking a third of the advancing force with it. There had been no visible explosives, no warning signs my sensors could detect beforehand. The humans had prepared this collapse hours, perhaps days, before the battle even began, anticipating an attack route that had not yet been chosen by their enemy. That was the moment my analysis systems flagged an inconsistency I could not ignore. According to every threat assessment on file, humans should not have been capable of this level of foresight. They were new to interstellar conflict. They had no data on Dravith tactics beyond what limited contact had provided. And yet they had built their defense around a battle that had not happened yet, as if they had somehow known exactly how their enemy would think. I lowered my shell slightly, drawn closer despite every protocol warning me to maintain distance. I told myself this was simply to improve the quality of my recording. In truth, I wanted to understand what I was watching. A young man named Daniel Ross, whose voice I would come to recognize over the following hours, was pulling an injured comrade behind a collapsed wall, while return fire chipped away the stone above his head. I expected him to leave the injured soldier and continue the retreat alone. Every efficient military doctrine I had studied treated wounded personnel as an acceptable loss during active combat, a resource to be triaged rather than rescued under fire. Daniel did not leave him. He dragged the wounded man nearly 40 meters under continuous fire, speaking to him the entire time in a tone that had nothing to do with tactics. "Stay with me, Owen. Just a little further. You're not dying out here. Not today." I ran a translation check 3 times, certain I had misunderstood the emotional context. I had not. Daniel was risking his own survival, reducing his tactical effectiveness, and exposing his position to enemy fire, all to save a single soldier whose loss would have had no measurable impact on the outcome of the battle. This behavior appeared again and again as the fighting continued. A young woman named Sophie Lane broke from a defensible position to shield a fallen comrade with her own body during an artillery strike. A man named Henry Voss carried an injured stranger nearly the length of a battlefield while firing behind himself with one hand. None of these actions made tactical sense. All of them happened anyway, repeated across dozens of positions, as if this behavior was not the exception among humans but the expectation. I began to understand, slowly and with growing discomfort, that I was not watching a disorganized species stumble through a battle by luck. I was watching a species fight, according to a completely different set of rules than any I had studied before, rules that valued the life of a single soldier as highly as the outcome of the entire engagement, and somehow, impossibly, that approach was working. The Dravith Coalition commander began adjusting his strategy, clearly recognizing that his initial assumptions had been wrong. He pulled his forces back into a tighter formation, attempting to force the humans into open ground where superior numbers would finally matter. It was, by every standard I understood, the correct decision. The humans refused to fight on his terms. Instead of engaging the tightened formation directly, they split into smaller, faster groups, striking from multiple directions in short, brutal exchanges, before disappearing back into the terrain. It was chaotic, it was unpredictable, and it was devastating to a force built entirely around discipline and predictability. I hovered above the battlefield, my sensors recording every movement, every voice, every impossible decision, and for the first time since accepting this assignment, I felt something my species rarely experiences during observation duty. I felt uncertain about what I was going to see next. My orders had told me this would be a short, simple skirmish, a formality, a training exercise, watching the wreckage of the coalition's first assault burning across the ridgeline below me. I understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that nothing about what I was witnessing was simple, and nothing about it was going to end quickly. I adjusted my shell's altitude, moved closer to the human command position, and prepared to keep recording. I did not yet know that this decision would change everything I believed about strength, about fear, and about the true nature of the species I had been sent to study. The coalition regrouped faster than I expected, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe the battle would return to a shape I could understand. Threx Kalor had lost nearly a third of his first assault force, but he still commanded overwhelming numbers, and he was not a foolish officer. He pulled his remaining troops into a defensive perimeter around the crashed transport ships, called for orbital reinforcements, and began methodically tightening his hold on the eastern approach to the human colony. It was a sound decision. It was the kind of decision that had won the coalition dozens of engagements against dozens of species before this one. I told myself the humans would break now. Their early success had been built on surprise and terrain, and surprise, by definition, cannot be repeated. I adjusted my analysis models accordingly and prepared to record a slow, grinding coalition victory over the following hours. I was wrong again, and this time the wrongness came from something I had not thought to measure at all. The humans did not slow down. If anything, they moved faster, more aggressively, as though the loss of their initial advantage had not shaken them, but sharpened them. I watched Grace Milton reorganize her forces in real time, pulling fighters back from exhausted positions and rotating in fresh ones with a fluidity that suggested this was not improvisation. This was practice. This was a species that had trained extensively for exactly this kind of prolonged, brutal engagement, even though, according to every record my Concord database held, humans had never fought a war on this scale before. That contradiction bothered me more than anything I had witnessed so far. I began cross-referencing everything I knew about human history, pulling from the limited cultural files the Concord had gathered during initial contact. What I found unsettled me. Humans had fought each other, extensively and repeatedly, for their entire recorded history, long before any alien species had ever made contact with them. Wars over land, over resources, over ideas that seemed, from an outside perspective, almost unbearably small. Thousands of years of conflict, refined and repeated, generation after generation, until something in the way this species approached combat had become less like a skill and more like an instinct buried into their very nature. I had assumed, incorrectly, that a young species meant an inexperienced one. I understood now that humanity was not inexperienced at all. They were simply inexperienced at fighting anyone other than themselves. That realization sat uncomfortably in my processing core as I watched the battle continue below me. Threx Kalor ordered his forces to advance under heavy cover fire, attempting to overwhelm the human position through sheer volume rather than precision. It was a brutal, simple strategy, and it should have worked against a smaller, less coordinated force. Explosions tore through the ridge where Daniel Ross and several others were holding a defensive line, and for a moment, my sensors lost track of individual heat signatures entirely, unable to distinguish survivors from the wreckage. A kind of tension I had never experienced during an observation assignment before. I told myself it was simply concern over losing valuable data, over the possibility that my recording would be incomplete. I did not yet want to admit it was something else. When the smoke cleared, most of them were still alive. Daniel had pulled 3 others into a shallow trench moments before the strike hit, reading the trajectory of incoming fire with an accuracy that no untrained soldier should have possessed. One of the survivors, a woman I would later know as Chloe Hart, immediately began treating a wound on another soldier's leg while continuing to return fire with her free hand, never once stopping to consider her own exposure. I watched her hands move with practiced calm, applying pressure and issuing instructions in the same breath she used to call out enemy positions. "Hold pressure here, Owen, cover the left, I've got him." There was no panic in her voice. There was no hesitation. This was not the behavior of soldiers overwhelmed by fear. This was the behavior of people who had trained, extensively and deliberately, for the exact horror they now found themselves living through. I began to understand that the humans were not simply reacting to this battle. They were executing a plan that had been built long before the Coalition ships had ever entered this system. A plan built around the assumption that they would be outnumbered, outgunned, and forced to fight for every meter of ground they held. The Coalition's second assault broke against the ridge exactly as the first had, though this time at a far greater cost to the defenders. I recorded the human losses with a strange, growing discomfort. This was not a species winning easily. This was a species winning at tremendous cost, and continuing to fight anyway, without any sign of the exhaustion or despair I had expected to see by now. It was during a brief lull in the fighting, as both sides regrouped for what I suspected would be a final and decisive engagement, that I witnessed something that fundamentally changed how I understood this species. A Coalition soldier, badly wounded and separated from his unit during the retreat, had collapsed near the edge of the human perimeter. My sensors flagged him immediately as a tactical opportunity, an easy target that would further weaken enemy morale if eliminated. I expected the humans to treat him exactly as such. Instead, Sophie Lane broke from her position, crossed open ground under the risk of enemy fire from both directions, and pulled the wounded Coalition soldier back toward the human perimeter. I watched this with something close to disbelief. This was not a soldier from her own side. This was an enemy combatant, someone who had, moments earlier, been actively trying to kill members of her unit. She did not hesitate. "Grace, I've got a wounded hostile, bringing him in." The response over the comm channel surprised me even more than the action itself. "Copy. Get him stable. We'll sort out the rest later." There was no debate, no hesitation from command, no suggestion that this decision required justification. It was simply accepted, immediately, as the correct thing to do, even in the middle of a battle where every resource, every second, every risk mattered enormously. I ran this exchange through my analysis systems repeatedly, searching for a tactical explanation that would make this decision rational within the frameworks I understood. Perhaps they wanted intelligence from the prisoner. Perhaps they intended to use him as leverage in some future negotiation. I built theory after theory, and each one collapsed the moment I compared it against what I was actually observing. They were not saving him for any strategic purpose. They were saving him because he was wounded, and because, in some way I did not yet fully understand, that fact alone was enough. I found myself unable to file this observation under any existing category in my reporting structure. The Concord's standard battlefield analysis templates had no field for actions that provided no measurable strategic benefit. I created a new category for the first time in my service history, uncertain even as I did it what I intended to name it. The battle resumed shortly after, and the Coalition, now reduced to less than half its original strength, made one final coordinated push toward the human colony's central structure. I understood, watching the formation reorganize below me, that this would likely be the decisive moment of the engagement. Every remaining Coalition soldier moved with the grim determination of a unit that knew retreat was no longer a realistic option. The humans met them without retreating either. What followed was not the clean, decisive battle I had expected when I first arrived at this posting. It was close, desperate, and chaotic, fought at ranges so short that my sensors struggled to track individual combatants through the smoke and debris. I watched Henry Voss stand his ground against 3 advancing Coalition soldiers alone, buying time for a group of colonists to reach an evacuation shelter behind him. I watched Grace Milton, her voice finally showing the first traces of strain, continue directing her forces even as the position around her began to collapse. And through it all, I watched something else. Something that unsettled me more than any tactical maneuver or unexpected strategy could have. I watched a species that refused, completely and without exception, to accept the idea that this battle could be lost. Not because they believed themselves invincible. I could see clearly, in every recorded casualty, in every strained voice over the comm channels, that they understood exactly how much this fight was costing them. They continued anyway, not out of blind confidence, but out of something that felt, uncomfortably, like choice. A decision made and remade with every passing second to keep standing, to keep fighting, to keep pulling wounded strangers and wounded enemies alike out of the fire, regardless of the cost. I had been sent to observe a battle. I was beginning to understand that I had, instead, been sent to observe something far more difficult to define, something my training had never prepared me to properly record. As the final assault reached its most desperate point, I made a decision that violated the very first rule of my assignment. I lowered my shell's altitude further than any observation protocol permitted, moving close enough that if my cloaking failed even briefly, I would be visible to both sides of the battle below. I told myself this was necessary for accurate data collection. In truth, I no longer wanted to watch this from a safe, comfortable distance. Something in me needed to understand, up close, what kind of species was capable of fighting like this, and I was no longer certain I was prepared for the answer. The final coalition assault hit the human perimeter like a collapsing wall, and for the first time since arriving on this moon, I genuinely did not know how the battle would end. Threx Kalor had committed everything he had left. Every remaining soldier, every functioning vehicle, every piece of equipment that could still fire a weapon was thrown into a single, overwhelming push toward the colony's central structure. I understood his reasoning immediately, even without access to his internal communications. He had run out of options that did not involve total commitment. This was no longer a battle fought for strategic advantage. This was a battle being fought because neither side had anywhere left to retreat to. I positioned my shell just above the central plaza, close enough now that the heat from nearby explosions registered directly against my hull sensors. I no longer cared about maintaining perfect observational distance. Something had shifted in me over the past several hours, something I did not yet have the language to properly describe, and I needed to see the end of this with a clarity that distance would not allow. Grace Milton's voice cut through the chaos on every human comm channel at once, steady despite the exhaustion I could hear building underneath it. This is it. Hold the line. Nobody falls back. Nobody gets left. I expected fear in the responses that followed. I expected the kind of desperate scattering that I had observed in dozens of other species during their final defensive stands, the moment when discipline breaks down entirely and every soldier begins acting purely out of self-preservation. That collapse did not come. Instead, I heard something closer to unity. Voices calling out positions, warning each other of incoming fire, coordinating movements with a precision that should have been impossible from soldiers who had already been fighting for hours without meaningful rest. Daniel Ross, blood visible along one side of his face in my sensor feed, was still pulling wounded colonists toward the evacuation shelter, moving with the same steady determination he had shown at the very beginning of the engagement. I watched Chloe Hart run out of medical supplies and continue treating the wounded anyway, using strips of torn fabric and whatever materials she could find nearby, refusing to stop even as coalition forces pushed closer to her position. I watched Henry Voss, badly injured himself, refuse evacuation in order to hold a defensive choke point that 3 other soldiers were depending on to survive. None of these actions made sense within the frameworks I had been trained to analyze. Efficient militaries protect their most valuable assets and sacrifice the expendable ones. Humans, it seemed, had decided that no one among them was expendable, and they were paying an enormous price for that belief with every passing minute. And yet, impossibly, they were not losing. The coalition's numerical advantage, which should have overwhelmed the defenders within the first hour of fighting, had been eroded so thoroughly by this point that the two sides were nearly matched. I ran the casualty projections again and again, certain I was making some calculation error, but the numbers refused to change. Humans were dying in significant numbers, yes, but coalition losses had reached a level that, by every standard military doctrine I understood, should have already triggered a full withdrawal. Threx Kalor did not withdraw. I would later understand, from intercepted coalition communications, that he had been given no authorization to retreat, that failure on this scale would end his career and likely far worse. He was trapped by his own chain of command as thoroughly as his soldiers were trapped by the battlefield itself. It was in the final, desperate minutes of the engagement, that I witnessed the moment that changed everything I believed about this species, the moment that I still cannot fully explain even now, long after the battle ended. A group of coalition soldiers, cut off from their main force and surrounded on three sides, made a final, near-suicidal charge toward the human position rather than surrender. I understood this decision immediately. Surrender to an unknown species, one they had been taught to view as primitive and disorganized, likely felt like a fate worse than continuing to fight. Fear of the unknown is a powerful motivator, even among the most disciplined soldiers. The human defenders could have simply eliminated them. The tactical advantage was entirely in their favor. The charging coalition soldiers were exhausted, poorly coordinated, and vastly outnumbered by this point in the engagement. Every model I had built over the past several hours suggested this would be a swift, decisive end to the threat. Instead, I heard Grace Milton's voice again, sharper now, cutting through the chaos with an urgency that had not been present before. Hold fire, they're breaking, not attacking, let them through. I did not understand the distinction she was making until several seconds later, when the charging coalition soldiers, instead of continuing their assault, began throwing down their weapons at the edge of the human perimeter. It had not been a final attack at all. It had been a desperate attempt to reach the only position on the battlefield where they believed they might survive, driven by exhaustion and terror rather than aggression, and Grace had recognized this from the pattern of their movement before I had even finished processing it myself. The humans took them in. I watched, my recording systems capturing every detail with mechanical precision, even as the rest of my processing struggled to comprehend what I was seeing, as Daniel Ross and several others moved to secure the surrendering coalition soldiers, providing medical attention to the wounded among them with the same urgency they had shown their own fallen comrades only minutes earlier. There was no cruelty in how they were treated, no punishment beyond disarmament. One of the surrendering soldiers, badly wounded and clearly expecting to be executed on the spot, flinched violently when Chloe Hart knelt beside him. She did not hesitate. "You're safe now. Stay still. Let me look at that wound." The soldier said something in response that my translation system struggled to parse clearly through the static and distortion, but the meaning came through regardless. Disbelief, confusion, an emotion that, in coalition military culture, had no clear equivalent, because coalition military culture had never conceived of an enemy that would choose mercy in a moment when total advantage belonged entirely to them. I found myself running calculations I had never needed to run before, trying to understand what possible benefit this behavior could provide to a species locked in an existential struggle for survival. I could find none. There was no strategic gain in treating a defeated enemy with dignity. There was no measurable advantage in risking further casualties to save the lives of soldiers who, only moments earlier, had been trying to kill you. And yet I was beginning to understand, with a growing and deeply unsettling clarity, that this was not a flaw in human military behavior. This was the entire point of it. Threx Kaller's remaining forces, seeing their comrades taken in rather than slaughtered, began to break in larger numbers across the battlefield. I watched coalition discipline, built on a foundation of absolute loyalty, enforced through fear of consequence, collapse entirely in the face of an enemy that offered something their own commanders never had. A reason to believe that surrender did not mean death. Within the hour, the battle that I had been sent to observe as a brief and simple formality had ended entirely, not through the total annihilation of one side, but through something closer to exhaustion and, impossibly, mutual respect. Threx Kaller himself, badly wounded and separated from what remained of his command, was found near the wreckage of his primary transport ship by a small group of human soldiers, led by Grace Milton herself. I expected this to be the moment of his execution, the final confirmation that even a species capable of unexpected mercy toward common soldiers would still exact appropriate vengeance upon an enemy commander responsible for so much loss. That expectation was wrong as well. Grace knelt beside him, and though I could not fully translate every word exchanged between them through the damage to my long-range audio pickup, I understood enough. She was not interrogating him. She was not threatening him. She was offering him medical attention, the same offer extended to every other wounded soldier on that battlefield, regardless of which side they had fought for. I recorded his response with particular care, sensing even then that this exchange would matter far beyond this single battle. "Why?" he asked, his voice weak and disbelieving. "Would you help me now? I brought this destruction to your people." Grace's answer was quiet, but my sensors captured it clearly enough. "Because the fighting's over, and because we don't need a reason for that not to matter anymore." I sat with that answer for a long time after recording it, hovering silently above a battlefield that had finally, mercifully, gone quiet. I had arrived expecting to document a simple, brief skirmish between an overwhelming coalition force and an inexperienced human colony. I had witnessed, instead, something I had no adequate category for within my entire training, a species that fought with a ferocity I had never seen matched, and then extended a mercy immediately afterward that I had never seen offered. I did not yet understand what this meant for how the Concord should regard this species. I only understood, with growing certainty, that everything I had been taught to expect from this assignment had been wrong, and that I was no longer simply an observer recording events from a safe and comfortable distance. Somewhere during those final hours on that burning moon, I had stopped watching humanity as a subject to be studied and started watching them as something closer to a mystery I desperately needed to understand. The silence after the battle was almost harder to process than the fighting itself. I remained hovering above the colony for several more hours, my systems working through an enormous backlog of recorded data, while the humans below began the long, exhausting work of dealing with what remained. There was no celebration. I had expected some form of triumphant display, the kind of victory posturing that many species engage in after a successful defense, but the humans moved instead with a quiet, methodical grief that I found more difficult to categorize than anything I had witnessed during the fighting itself. Grace Milton walked the length of the ridge where the first defensive line had held, stopping at intervals that I gradually understood corresponded to the positions where members of her unit had fallen. She did not speak much during these stops. She simply stood, for a moment, before continuing on. I found myself recording these silences with the same careful attention I had given to the battle itself, sensing, correctly, that they carried just as much meaning. Daniel Ross was among a group organizing the wounded for transport to the colony's medical facility, working alongside Chloe Hart to ensure that both human and coalition survivors received equal care. I watched this continued equal treatment with particular attention, curious whether the mercy shown during the battle's final moments had been a temporary exception born of exhaustion, or something deeper and more consistent within their behavior. It was, I would come to learn over the following hours, entirely consistent. Coalition prisoners, including several who had fought with genuine brutality during the earlier waves of the assault, were housed separately but not mistreated. Food and medical supplies, already stretched thin by the battle's demands, were shared without apparent resentment. I overheard one young human soldier, a man named Owen whose life Daniel had saved earlier in the fighting, speaking quietly with one of the coalition prisoners, through a translation device the colony had assembled from salvaged equipment. "You were just following orders," Owen said, his voice tired but without hostility. "I get it. We would have done the same thing, probably, if someone told us this was our only choice." The coalition soldier's response was hesitant, clearly uncertain how to process an enemy who spoke to him with something resembling understanding rather than contempt. "Your commanders permit this? Speaking to prisoners this way?" Owen laughed, though there was little humor in it. "We don't really have commanders telling us how to feel about people. We just decide that ourselves." I found this exchange particularly significant, and I flagged it immediately within my growing collection of observations that did not fit neatly into any existing Concord analytical framework. Humans, it seemed, did not require external authority to determine how they treated others, even others who had recently tried to kill them. This behavior appeared to emerge from something internal, something I still lacked adequate language to properly describe. Threx Calor, still recovering from his injuries under human medical care, requested to speak with Grace Milton privately several hours after the fighting had ended. I adjusted my long-range audio sensors carefully, aware that this conversation might provide critical insight into how this engagement would ultimately be resolved. "I do not understand your species," he said, his voice still weak but steadier than before. "Our intelligence reports described you as disorganized, undisciplined, a species without the coordination necessary for serious military resistance. That assessment was catastrophically wrong." Grace considered this for a moment before responding. "We're not disorganized. We just don't organize the way you expected us to." Every person out there today knew exactly what they were fighting for, and they didn't need someone standing over them with a weapon to make sure they kept fighting for it. And that alone was enough to defeat a force 3 times your size. And we don't leave anyone behind if we can help it. Doesn't matter if it makes tactical sense, it's just what we do. I recorded this exchange with growing unease, recognizing that Grace's explanation, simple as it sounded, described something far more complex and far more dangerous than the Coalition's intelligence assessments had prepared anyone for. A species that fought not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine voluntary commitment to one another, was not simply difficult to defeat through conventional military means. It was, potentially, nearly impossible to defeat at all, so long as that commitment remained intact. Threx Calor seemed to reach a similar conclusion, though his response carried a weight of resignation rather than alarm. "Then I owe you an apology, on behalf of a command structure that severely underestimated what your people were capable of. I do not know what will happen to me when I return to Coalition territory, given the scale of this failure, but I understand now why it happened." Grace's response was measured, without triumph or cruelty. "We're not interested in your apology. We're interested in this not happening again. Whatever you tell your command when you get back, make sure they understand that clearly." I processed this exchange for a considerable amount of time after it concluded, running it against everything else I had witnessed over the course of this engagement. This was not simply a battle that humanity had won through unexpected tactical brilliance. This was a demonstration of something far more foundational about how this species approached conflict, community, and the value of a single life within a larger struggle. I requested early extraction from my superiors that evening, uncertain whether I could continue observing this colony without my own analytical objectivity being further compromised by what I had witnessed. The request was denied. My orders required a complete assessment of the engagement's aftermath, including any long-term behavioral patterns the colony demonstrated during recovery. I remained in position, watching as the humans below began the slow process of rebuilding what the battle had destroyed. What struck me most, over the following days, was not any single dramatic event, but the steady accumulation of small, quiet moments that continued to defy everything I had been trained to expect from a species recovering after significant losses. I watched human colonists, many of whom had lost friends or family during the assault, help rebuild damaged structures alongside Coalition prisoners who had been part of the force responsible for those losses. I watched children, too young to fully understand the scale of what had happened, brought food by soldiers, still wearing the marks of battle, comforted with a gentleness that seemed entirely disconnected from the brutality I had witnessed only hours earlier from those same soldiers. I began to understand something that troubled me deeply, something that reshaped how I would eventually need to report on this species to my superiors. Humanity's capacity for extraordinary violence and their capacity for extraordinary compassion were not separate, contradictory traits existing in tension with one another. They were the same trait, expressed differently depending entirely on what the moment demanded of them. This realization unsettled me more than any tactical detail from the battle itself. A species capable of fighting with such ferocity, and then immediately extending genuine mercy to the very enemies responsible for their losses, was not simply unpredictable. It was, in its own way, one of the most consistent and dangerous combinations I had ever encountered during my career as an observer. Consistent, because the underlying principle never changed. Dangerous, because that principle made humanity nearly impossible to properly threaten, contain, or defeat through conventional means. I thought back to my original assignment briefing, to my own dismissive assumptions about a species barely out of their own solar system, and felt something that I can only describe, even now, as genuine unease about my own initial judgment. I had been sent to observe humans in battle, expecting to document a simple, unremarkable skirmish that would earn me little recognition and even less concern from my superiors. Instead, I had witnessed the emergence of something I suspected the entire galaxy would eventually need to understand far more carefully than the Concord currently did. As I prepared to begin drafting my formal report, I realized I no longer knew how to summarize what I had seen in the clean, detached language my training demanded. Every attempt I made to reduce this engagement to a simple tactical assessment felt incomplete, dishonest even, in a way that troubled my normally straightforward analytical processes. I did not yet know that finishing this report would prove to be the most difficult task of my entire career. 3 days after the battle ended, I received new orders to return to Concord territory and submit my complete findings before a review panel of senior analysts. I had expected relief at the prospect of finally leaving this posting behind. What I felt instead was something closer to dread, though it took me some time to understand exactly why. Before departing, I made one final pass over the colony, recording the last details of a recovery effort that had continued steadily over the previous days. The human settlement, though scarred and still rebuilding, no longer resembled the desperate battlefield I had first descended into. Structures were being repaired, supply lines had been re-established with a nearby human outpost, and the coalition prisoners, including Threx Kalor himself, were being prepared for a supervised transfer back to their own territory, an arrangement negotiated peacefully between Grace Milton and what remained of the coalition's regional command structure. I found this final development almost more remarkable than anything that had come before it. Rather than treating their prisoners as leverage or punishment, the humans had simply returned them, asking for nothing beyond a formal acknowledgement that hostilities would not resume. There was no demand for reparations, no insistence on humiliating terms. Grace explained her reasoning to a colony administrator during a conversation I happened to record while conducting my final sweep of the area. "We're not trying to make an example out of them," she said. "We just want this to be over, properly over, so nobody has to go through this again." The administrator, an older woman named Lily Frayne who had overseen the colony's civilian operations throughout the crisis, nodded slowly. "Some people back home won't understand that kind of mercy. They'll say we should have made them pay for what they did here." Grace considered this for a moment before answering. "Maybe, but holding on to that kind of anger doesn't bring anyone back. It just makes sure the next fight is worse than this one. I'd rather they go home, understanding that we're not an easy target, and also not an enemy they need to keep fighting forever. Both of those things can be true at once." I recorded this exchange as my final piece of field data before beginning my journey back to Concord territory, and I found myself replaying it repeatedly throughout the return trip, searching for some flaw in the logic that would allow me to dismiss it as naive or strategically unsound. I could not find one. If anything, the more I analyzed it, the more I understood that this approach, mercy paired with unmistakable strength, represented one of the most stable long-term strategies I had ever encountered in any species' approach to conflict resolution. When I arrived back at Concord Command, I was brought before a review panel of senior analysts, all of whom had access to only the raw tactical data from my mission, none of the deeper context I had personally witnessed. They expected a straightforward briefing, a clean summary of coalition losses, human tactical decisions, and a final threat assessment that could be filed away and forgotten, much as my superiors had expected before I ever departed on this assignment. I found, standing before them, that I could not deliver the report they were expecting. The engagement resulted in significant losses for the Dravith Coalition, I began, my voice carrying the same measured tone I had used in countless reports before this one. Approximately 62% of committed forces were killed, wounded, or captured during the course of the battle. Human casualties, while considerable, were substantially lower in comparison. One of the senior panelists, an analyst whose designation I recognized from several previous mission reviews, interrupted with visible impatience. These numbers were already available from preliminary data feeds. We require your assessment of underlying tactical causes. Was this a result of superior technology, superior numbers, or simple coalition incompetence? I paused before answering, aware that my response would shape how the entire Concord understood this species for years, perhaps decades to come. None of those factors alone, I said finally. The coalition possessed superior numbers and comparable technology. Their forces were professionally trained and competently led. Their defeat cannot be attributed to any conventional military failing. Then what caused it? I found myself hesitating in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar, searching for language precise enough to convey what I had witnessed without diminishing its significance through oversimplification. Humans fight for each other, I said eventually, not for territory, not for resources, not out of fear of punishment from their own command structure. They fight because they have made a voluntary personal commitment to the survival of the people beside them, and that commitment does not weaken under pressure, it strengthens. I watched soldiers risk their own survival repeatedly to save comrades whose loss would have carried no measurable tactical consequence. I watched them extend that same commitment to enemy combatants the moment those combatants ceased to be a threat. This is not a flaw in their military doctrine. It is the foundation of it, and it makes them extraordinarily difficult to defeat through conventional means. The panel exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for an assessment that could not be neatly translated into standard threat classifications. Are you suggesting, another panelist asked slowly, that this species represents an existential threat to Concord interests? No, I said, and I meant it. I am suggesting something more complicated than that. Humans are not inherently aggressive toward those who do not threaten them. Every act of mercy I witnessed during and after this engagement was genuine, offered without any expectation of strategic benefit. But their capacity for loyalty translates directly and immediately into a capacity for ferocity when that loyalty is threatened. I would strongly advise against provoking this species through hostile action of any kind. I do not believe they can be intimidated into submission. I believe, based on everything I witnessed, that pressure applied against them will only strengthen their resistance. I paused, aware that what I said next would likely be dismissed by at least some members of this panel as an overreaction, an emotional response unbecoming of a trained Concord observer. I said it anyway. I would also advise that any future contact with this species be approached with genuine respect rather than the dismissive assumptions that shaped this particular mission's original briefing. I arrived at this assignment believing I was documenting an unremarkable skirmish involving a primitive, disorganized species. I am filing this report having witnessed something considerably more significant, a demonstration of resilience, sacrifice, and mercy that I believe deserves careful, ongoing study rather than casual dismissal. The panel remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking, and I understood, watching their expressions, that my report would likely be filed with considerable internal debate rather than the routine acceptance most observation missions received. I do not know, even now, exactly how the Concord ultimately chose to classify humanity following my report. That decision extended far beyond my authority or influence. What I do know is that I requested, and was granted, reassignment away from any future postings involving direct observation of human military engagements. It was not fear that motivated this request, though I understand why some might assume that. It was something closer to a recognition of my own limitations. I had gone into that assignment as a detached, objective observer, confident in my ability to record events without being changed by them. That confidence had not survived the battle I witnessed on that burning moon. I think often of Grace Milton's voice, steady and calm even as everything around her burned. I think of Daniel Ross, refusing to leave a single wounded soldier behind, regardless of the cost to himself. I think of Chloe Hart's hands, treating friend and enemy alike with the same careful urgency. And I think, more than anything else, of the quiet conversation between Grace and Threx Kalor, an exchange of genuine mercy between two people who had every reason, by every standard the galaxy generally operates under, to hate each other. I was ordered to observe humans in battle. I completed that assignment exactly as instructed, recording every detail my superiors requested with complete accuracy and thoroughness. But somewhere during those long, brutal hours on that small, burning moon, I stopped being simply an observer. I became something closer to a witness, and witnessing changes a person in ways that observation alone never can. I do not regret what I saw. I regret only that I ever believed, even for a moment, that a species capable of such extraordinary devotion to one another could ever have been dismissed as unremarkable. I was wrong about humanity from the very beginning of this assignment, and I suspect, if the rest of the galaxy is not careful, a great many others will eventually find themselves wrong about them as well.